I always thought I could escape my past. Growing up in a broken home, betrayal and deceit felt like the only constants in my life. My mother, constantly flitting between men, would drift in and out of the house, leaving me to fill in the blanks of where she'd been. As for my father, well, he wasn't really my father. I was the product of one of her many escapades, a detail I discovered in the cruelest way possible, right as my family was collapsing in on itself. As the youngest, I watched my siblings scatter, each trying to get away from the dysfunction and lies. So, I promised myself that one day, I'd build something better. A real family. A marriage rooted in loyalty, love, and trust. When I met Rebecca, I thought I'd finally found someone who wanted the same. She was everything my mother wasn't. Lively, ambitious, and someone who seemed genuinely interested in creating a future with me. Sure, she was flirtatious, maybe a little too much so, and her family's disdain for me was obvious from the start. But I brushed it off. I told myself that her bold personality was just part of her charm, that her family's judgment didn't matter. After all, I wanted a life with her, not with them. The cracks began to show almost immediately after the wedding. Rebecca's bold personality began to feel more like blatant disregard, her flirtations less like innocent fun and more like a thinly veiled threat. She enjoyed the attention of other men a little too much, always insisting it was harmless. But deep down, I knew better. The ghosts of my past whispered to me, warning that she would be the same as everyone else. Still, I shoved those fears aside, burying them under my desperate need to believe in her. That's how we ended up at a wedding in her hometown one summer, a place she still held tight to despite the years that had passed. For her, it was a reunion of sorts. All her old high school friends were there, including Steve, an old boyfriend her family had always openly preferred over me. For me, it was an opportunity to prove that I belonged in her world, to finally feel like I was more than an outsider in my own marriage. But as soon as the reception started, I knew I was in trouble. Rebecca had always been lively, sure, but that night something changed. As the drinks flowed, she became someone else entirely, laughing a little too loudly, dancing a little too close to her friends, especially Steve. I watched as she tossed back drink after drink, practically reveling in the attention. It wasn't just me she was abandoning. It was the very idea of us, the loyalty she'd sworn to uphold. Each laugh, each lingering glance she shared with Steve and the other men there felt like a knife in my back. But when I tried to pull her aside, to ask what in God's name she thought she was doing, she laughed, brushing me off with a smirk. "Oh, stop being such a party pooper, Nick," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Just because you're a bore doesn't mean I have to be." The words stung more than I cared to admit. I watched her slip back onto the dance floor, leaving me alone, my face hot with anger and humiliation. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as she threw herself back into the crowd, laughing and dancing as if I didn't exist. The memories of my mother's infidelities came flooding back, haunting me, whispering that I'd made the same mistake my father had. That night, I watched the woman I'd married come undone before my very eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. But it got worse. As the evening wore on, Rebecca grew bolder. She danced with other men, allowing them to pull her close in ways she'd never permitted with me. Her touch, her laugh, everything was reserved for them, not for the man she'd vowed to love. I wanted to grab her, to pull her aside, and demand she explain herself. But each time I tried, she'd slip away, her mocking laughter trailing behind her. The more she avoided me, the more I saw her for what she truly was, a self-centered, manipulative woman who enjoyed humiliating me as much as she enjoyed the attention of every man in the room. And then she disappeared. I don't know when it happened. One minute she was on the dance floor, practically wrapped around Steve, and the next she was gone. Panic clawed at my chest, though I couldn't tell if it was fear or anger driving me. Part of me knew exactly where she'd gone, but I pushed that thought aside, unwilling to face the reality. After a while, I went looking for her, feeling like a fool as I wandered through the reception hall, my stomach churning with each empty room I found. Eventually, a horrible suspicion solidified in my mind, one I couldn't ignore any longer. Following a hunch, I left the reception hall and made my way down the hotel corridors, my fists clenched as I navigated the dimly lit hallways. When I found Steve's room, I didn't hesitate. The door was cracked open, and inside, the faint sounds of laughter drifted out, taunting me. Steeling myself, I pushed the door open, hoping, praying, I was wrong. But I wasn't. The scene in front of me was a nightmare made real. Rebecca was there, surrounded by Steve and a few of his friends. She was completely wrapped up in their attention, laughing and flirting as if she were the queen of some twisted court. Her dress was slipping from her shoulders, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with the thrill of their attention. And worst of all, she didn't even notice me standing there. One of the men, a smug grin on his face, caught sight of me in the doorway. With a mocking bow, he said, Well, looks like the husband finally showed up. Enjoying the show, buddy?" He laughed, and the others joined in, their laughter mingling with Rebecca's. I wanted to lunge at him, to knock that smirk off his face. But as I took a step forward, one of them pulled out a knife, his smile darkening as he brandished it with a deadly gleam. "I wouldn't try anything if I were you," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The threat was clear, and as much as I hated it, I backed down, feeling the rage boiling inside me as I watched them treat my wife like some kind of twisted trophy. And Rebecca? She barely seemed to register my presence. She was too wrapped up in the moment, her eyes locked on Steve, her laughter mingling with his in a sickening symphony that tore through me. In that instant, something inside me broke. The humiliation, the betrayal, it was all consuming. The love I'd once felt for her was gone, replaced by something darker, something far more dangerous. I stood there, watching as she abandoned every promise she'd made to me, every vow she'd sworn to uphold. And in that moment, I vowed to make her pay. They'd all pay. Without a word, I turned and left the room, leaving her behind with her new friends. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. But I wasn't about to confront her. Not yet. No, I had something far more satisfying in mind. Rebecca would learn, soon enough, that you don't betray someone like me without consequences. I spent the rest of that night sitting alone in our hotel room, the darkness pressing in around me as the weight of Rebecca's betrayal sank in. My mind replayed the scene over and over, each detail cutting deeper than the last. Her laughter, the way she'd leaned into Steve's embrace, her complete disregard for me, all of it burned into my memory like a scar I'd never be able to erase. I'd seen her for who she truly was, a selfish, manipulative woman who craved attention above all else, a woman who would happily betray her own husband to relive her glory days. But the anger that simmered in me wasn't only directed at her. No, I was furious with myself as well, for ignoring all the signs, for letting my desperation for a stable life cloud my judgment. I convinced myself that she was different, that she would somehow be better than the people who had shaped my past. In truth, I'd simply traded one kind of betrayal for another. But unlike my father, I wasn't going to sit back and let her walk all over me. I was done being the loyal, dependable husband who would forgive and forget. I would never forgive her for this. Not now, not ever. If Rebecca thought she could betray me and then come crawling back like nothing had happened, she was in for a brutal awakening. The first step was to make a clean break. I knew if I confronted her immediately, she'd find a way to twist the narrative, painting herself as the victim in some twisted version of events. No, I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I'd take control quietly, slipping away from her life without her realizing what was happening until it was too late. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Kathy's name, Rebecca's sister. Kathy had always been the only member of Rebecca's family who treated me with respect, the only one who saw through her sister's charming facade. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how she'd react, but then the memory of Rebecca's mocking laughter surged back, strengthening my resolve. I pressed call and waited as the line connected. Kathy answered, her voice groggy with sleep. "Neek, what's going on?" "It's the middle of the night." "I'm sorry to wake you, Kathy," I said, keeping my tone calm and controlled. "But I needed to tell you something." I thought you deserved to know what your sister's been up to." There was a long silence on the other end, and then she spoke, her voice sharp with worry. "What are you talking about? Is everything okay?" "Rebecca," I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. "She's been cheating on me. I found her tonight in Steve's hotel room." She wasn't alone. Another silence. This one longer, and I could practically hear Kathy processing what I just told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with anger and disgust. That doesn't surprise me, honestly. I always knew she was selfish, but this... I'm so sorry, Nick. It's not your fault, Kathy. But I need your help. I need to know everything about Steve and his friends. Names, addresses, any information you can give me. Kathy didn't hesitate. "I'll get you whatever you need. I know those guys. They're all a bunch of lowlifes. If you're planning something, count me in." Rebecca deserves everything that's coming to her. Her support was a small comfort in the storm raging inside me, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this. We talked for a few more minutes, hashing out details and making plans, and by the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction settling over me. This wasn't going to be just a simple walk-away divorce. No, I was going to make sure Rebecca regretted every second of that night. With Kathy on my side, I began to lay the groundwork for my plan. Over the next few days, I'd make myself scarce, slipping away from her life as quietly as possible. I wouldn't give her any indication of what I was planning, no hint of the storm brewing just below the surface. I wanted her to feel the confusion and frustration of being left in the dark, to know that something was wrong, but not be able to put her finger on it. I packed my bags, careful not to leave anything behind, and checked out of the hotel before the sun was up, making my way back to our home alone. As I drove, the early morning light creeping over the horizon, I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction settle over me. I wasn't done with Rebecca, not by a long shot, but I was done letting her control my emotions. From this point on, everything I did would be on my terms. When I got home, I went through the house, removing anything that held sentimental value to me. I didn't want to leave her with any reminders of the life we'd built together, any chance to cling to the illusion of what we'd once shared. Every photo, every little memento I collected over the years, I packed it all up and stored it away, leaving the house stripped of anything that might remind her of me. Next, I filed for divorce, carefully crafting the terms to protect myself and make things as difficult as possible for her. I ensured that she wouldn't receive a penny more than she deserved, cutting her off from the financial support she'd become accustomed to. And to twist the knife a little deeper, I added a clause stating that I would only be responsible for child support if a paternity test confirmed my biological connection to any future child she might claim was mine. I doubted she'd try to use children as leverage, but I wasn't taking any chances. The paperwork was just the beginning. I'd heard rumors about Steve's less-than-legal activities, and with Kathy's help, I started gathering information on him and his friends. If Rebecca wanted to align herself with criminals, I'd make sure she reaped the consequences. I dug deep, pulling up records and connections, laying the foundation for what would eventually expose the men she'd thrown herself at. I wasn't going to stop until every one of them paid for humiliating me that night. A few days later, Rebecca finally called. The sound of her name lighting up my screen sent a surge of anger through me, but I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself of the bigger picture. I answered, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "Nick, where are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp with confusion and frustration. "You just disappeared after the wedding. I've been trying to call you." I let the silence stretch out, savoring her discomfort. "I thought you'd enjoy a little taste of what it feels like to be abandoned," I said, my voice icy. "Or maybe you didn't notice, too busy with Steve and his friends." Her breath hitched, but she recovered quickly, launching into damage control. "Oh, come on, Nick. It was just a little fun. You were being such a drag at the wedding. I thought you'd left me to enjoy myself. I didn't think you'd be so dramatic about it." "Dramatic?" I repeated, my voice laced with contempt. "Watching you with them was hardly what I'd call fun. You humiliated me, Rebecca, and you think I'm overreacting?" She sighed, as if I were some child throwing a tantrum. "Look, it was a mistake, okay? I had too much to drink. Things got out of hand. But it was just one night, Nick. Don't throw everything away over a stupid mistake. A cold rage settled over me as I listened to her pathetic excuses. She was trying to brush it off as if it were nothing, as if betraying me in the most public, humiliating way possible was something I should just forgive and forget. But I was done forgiving. There's nothing left to throw away, I said, my voice steely. You destroyed it, and now you'll live with the consequences. Before she could respond, I ended the call, blocking her number. She'd have no way to reach me now. I knew she'd turn to her family next, spinning some sob story about how I'd overreacted, but Kathy was on my side. Rebecca would find no allies there. With each step I took, with every cold, calculated move, I felt myself growing stronger. This wasn't about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about making sure she knew that I was not a man to be crossed. The next few weeks passed in a calculated, deliberate silence. I vanished from Rebecca's life as if I had never existed, leaving her in a void of unanswered questions and cold silence. From what Kathy told me, Rebecca was furious. She ran into her family, spinning tales of how I had abandoned her over nothing, trying to cast herself as the victim. But it was futile. Kathy had told her family the truth, and most of them knew Rebecca too well to believe her lies. Despite Rebecca's attempts to control the narrative, the details of her behavior at the wedding slowly began to filter through our social circles. Her friends started whispering, stories blending into ugly rumors that cast her in an unforgiving light. She was beginning to feel the fallout, and from what Kathy said, her frustration was building. Each rumor, each sideways glance from friends, each strained interaction with her family, everything fed into the plan I was so carefully laying. I could see her trying to claw her way back, texting mutual friends and reaching out to my family to explain what had happened. But I had gotten to everyone important first. Every message she sent, every tearful phone call, was met with cold indifference or worse, outright rejection. She was beginning to understand that her actions had left her isolated, and her desperation was almost palpable. Each day, I could feel the walls of her carefully constructed image closing in around her. I spent that time quietly solidifying the terms of our divorce, cutting her off from every last benefit she'd assumed would be hers. Rebecca had gotten used to our comfortable life, our shared savings, the little luxuries that my hard work had afforded her. But now, she was about to learn how quickly those comforts could be taken away. The final straw came when I received a call from her attorney, a simpering voice that dripped with thinly veiled contempt. "Nick, I think we can come to an arrangement here," he said, sounding as if he were speaking to a wayward child. Rebecca has expressed some regret over her actions. She'd like to avoid any unpleasantness in these proceedings. I almost laughed at his audacity. "Regret?" I asked, letting the silence linger just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Tell me, did she express that regret before or after she publicly humiliated me with her high school boyfriend and his friends?" There was a pause, and I could hear him struggling to maintain his composure. "Nick, there's no need for this to become hostile. She's willing to discuss fair terms for alimony." "I'm sure she is." I cut in, my voice like ice. "But here's the thing. I'm not interested in being fair. I'm interested in justice. And if you think I'm going to support her after what she did, then you're even more naive than she is." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I hung up without another word, feeling a twisted satisfaction settle over me. This was only the beginning. She would lose more than just money in this divorce. I was taking everything from her, stripping away every security she'd come to rely on, making sure she felt the weight of her actions with every breath. I spent the next few days gathering final pieces of evidence, tracking down Steve's friends, ensuring that everything I discovered about them was documented and ready for when I needed it. Rebecca was about to feel the sting of her own choices, and I'd make sure she couldn't escape the consequences this time. A week later, I had a package delivered to Rebecca's parents' house, one containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered about her actions. Photos, texts, screenshots of messages she'd thought she'd deleted. A single note was attached, one simple line that said, "This is the woman you raised." Kathy had been more than willing to help me pull this together, and when Rebecca received the package, her family was there to witness it. I heard about the fallout through Kathy's quiet updates. Her mother, normally her biggest defender, was horrified, while her father simply walked out of the room in disgust. Rebecca's perfect image was unraveling before her very eyes, and for once, there was nothing she could say or do to twist the narrative. I could almost imagine the scene. Rebecca tearing through the package, each photo a slap in the face, each screenshot a nail in the coffin of her own lies. And the knowledge that her family knew everything, that they saw her for who she truly was. It was a small taste of the humiliation she'd inflicted on me, but it was enough. In the days that followed, Rebecca began reaching out to me in desperation. At first, her messages were angry, laced with accusations, as if this whole thing was somehow my fault. "How dare you air our dirty laundry to my family?" she spat in one message. "You have no right to turn them against me." I ignored her. Then the tone shifted. Her messages became softer, more apologetic, filled with empty promises and pathetic pleas. "Nick, I was drunk. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. Please, we can fix this." Still, I ignored her. Finally, her desperation hit a fever pitch. She began sending me voice messages, her voice cracked and trembling, begging me to forgive her, to give her one more chance. She talked about how we could rebuild, how she needed me in her life. But each message only fueled my anger, each word a reminder of the countless lies she'd told. I knew she would try to twist the story if I gave her even an inch. She'd try to make herself look like the victim, to manipulate her way back into my good graces. But I was done with her games. I'd seen the real Rebecca, and there was no coming back from what she'd done. One night, after a particularly long string of tearful messages, I finally replied. My words were cold, calculated, crafted to cut through any last remnants of hope she might have been clinging to. "You made your choice, Rebecca," I wrote. "You threw away everything we had, everything I gave you, for one night of cheap thrills. I don't want your apologies, and I don't want you in my life. You're nothing to me now." Her response was almost immediate, a desperate plea that reeked of panic. "Nick, please, I didn't mean to hurt you. It was a mistake. Can we at least talk about this? I need to see you. I'll do anything." I knew what she was trying to do. Pull me back in, manipulate me with her desperation. But I'd played this game long enough. I was done being her pawn. My final message was short and brutal. "Save your breath. This divorce is going through, and you're getting nothing. Find someone else to play your games with." I could almost feel the shock and anger radiating through the phone as I read her response. She tried one last time, begging me to reconsider, claiming she'd do anything to make it right. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I'd made up my mind, and nothing she could say would change that. The divorce papers arrived soon after, and I signed them without hesitation, ensuring that every last clause was in place to cut her off entirely. There would be no alimony, no shared assets, nothing. She would be left with only what she'd brought into the marriage, stripped of every comfort she'd come to expect. And the clause about paternity? I left that in there as a final insult, a reminder of the life she'd tried to ruin. But I wasn't finished. I reached out to Steve's employer, using the information I'd gathered to subtly expose his connections to less-than-legal activities. It wasn't long before he lost his job, his reputation in tatters. And his friends? They weren't far behind. I'd made sure their names were known, that their associations with each other would follow them like a dark cloud, cutting them off from any respectable circles. With each piece of my plan falling into place, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Rebecca had tried to destroy me, to humiliate me, but in the end, it was her life that was unraveling, her world that was crumbling. And all I had to do was let her see the consequences of her actions, to watch as the image she'd crafted for herself shattered beyond repair. As I walked away from that chapter of my life, I felt no remorse, no regret. Rebecca had shown me exactly who she was, and I had finally shown her that I was no longer the naive, forgiving man she'd once manipulated. She would live the rest of her life in the ruins of her own choices, and I would move forward, free from the toxic ties that had bound me to her. In the end, she had no one to blame but herself. After finalizing the divorce and watching Rebecca's carefully constructed life crumble around her, I thought I would feel some sense of closure, perhaps even peace. But if anything, the satisfaction of seeing her fall was only the beginning. She'd humiliated me on such a profound level, and for her, that one night of betrayal had been nothing more than a cheap thrill. For me, it was a night that would stay burned in my memory forever, a betrayal that went deeper than I ever imagined possible. That's when I realized taking away her financial security wasn't enough. She needed to feel the same humiliation she'd inflicted on me, to experience firsthand the sting of public shame. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about letting her taste the bitterness of being cast aside. I wanted her to walk into every room, every social circle, knowing that people saw her as the fraud she was. I was prepared to orchestrate a downfall so thorough that she wouldn't be able to show her face without being reminded of her actions. To start, I called in a few favors with some mutual friends, people she respected and relied on for social standing. People who I knew would be absolutely disgusted by what she'd done. With a few choice words, I planted the seeds of the truth, letting them know exactly what had happened at the wedding, ensuring every sordid detail was impossible to ignore. These weren't just any acquaintances. They were people she depended on, her closest allies who could either bolster her reputation or tear it down completely. One by one, they distanced themselves from her, making it clear that her betrayal had severed every bond she'd once held dear. The fallout was fast and ruthless. Rebecca tried to play the innocent, pulling her usual tricks, crocodile tears, deflection, even trying to play the victim. But I'd anticipated every move. I'd already shared enough evidence to make sure her lies couldn't gain traction. Her excuses fell flat. Her cries for sympathy met with cold indifference. And for the first time, I saw her for what she really was. Alone, isolated, her web of charm and manipulation unraveling with each failed attempt to reclaim her old life. As the weeks went on, her desperation grew. She showed up at my door one night, looking disheveled and frantic, her voice pleading as she knocked, louder and louder, until I opened the door just to end the pathetic display. "Nick, please just hear me out," she begged, her eyes wide and tear-filled. She looked like a shadow of the woman I'd once loved, unhinged, desperate, clutching at whatever fragments she thought she could salvage. "What do you want, Rebecca?" I asked coldly, crossing my arms and blocking her from coming any further inside. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I was drunk. I don't even know why I did it. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed, trying to pull together some semblance of the remorse she'd clearly practiced in the mirror. "I never thought I'd lose everything because of one night. Can't we at least talk about it? Can't you forgive me?" "Forgive you?" I repeated, incredulous. "Rebecca, this isn't just about one night. It's about every lie, every manipulation, every moment you spent treating me like I was disposable. You think you can come back now, after everything, and I'll just let it all go?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment I almost believed the tears. But then I remembered the mocking laughter, the smug taunts, the way she'd looked at Steve with that glint in her eye that I'd never seen her use with me. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching out to touch my arm. I pulled away, and she let out a shaky breath. "Please, I'll do anything to make it up to you. We can go to therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right." "Making this right?" I shook my head, almost laughing. "Rebecca, you can't undo what you did. You're just sorry you got caught, sorry that people are finally seeing you for who you really are." I watched her struggle, her gaze flicking between pleading and anger, as if she couldn't decide whether to keep begging or lash out. When it became clear that I wasn't budging, her expression hardened. "So, that's it then? You're going to ruin my life just because of one mistake?" She spat, the desperation in her voice replaced by venom. "You're not perfect, Nick. Don't pretend like you're some saint." I chuckled, a low, humorless sound that seemed to rattle her. "The difference, Rebecca, is that I never promised to be perfect. But I did promise loyalty, and that's something you threw away without a second thought." Her face twisted, the mask she'd been wearing finally slipping, revealing the bitterness and entitlement simmering underneath. Fine, go ahead and ruin me. But don't think this makes you any better than me. You're just as vindictive, just as twisted. I stepped back, holding the door open for her to leave. Maybe I am, but at least I'll be free of you. With one final glare, she stormed off, leaving a bitter silence in her wake. I watched her walk away, feeling no remorse, no pang of regret. She'd made her choice, and now she would live with the consequences. The next step in my plan was both simple and devastating, a public reveal. I wasn't interested in flashy revenge or making a scene. No, I wanted a quiet, powerful exposure that would haunt her for years. I arranged for a mutual friends gathering, one I knew she would attend, hoping to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. Kathy had tipped me off about the event, and I knew it would be the perfect setting to make sure the truth reached everyone who mattered. When I arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. People eyed me curiously, some approaching with hushed condolences, others offering awkward nods. Rebecca wasn't there yet, which gave me just enough time to set everything in motion. I approached the host, pulling her aside and sharing just enough of the story to ensure she understood what Rebecca had done. I didn't need to go into graphic detail. The look on the host's face told me she was horrified, and the knowledge would spread faster than wildfire. When Rebecca finally arrived, I watched as the whispers began, people glancing at her, their expressions shifting from friendly to contemptuous. She noticed, of course, trying to keep her head high, forcing a smile that was more brittle than bright. But the more she approached people, the more they pulled away, unwilling to entertain her lies. She was like a leper in a crowd of people who once adored her, and the realization that she was unwelcome, unwanted, slowly dawned on her. I could see the exact moment when she realized that I was behind it, her eyes locking onto mine from across the room. She glared, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, but I simply met her gaze with a cold, steady stare. She'd wanted to play games, to humiliate me in front of others, but now the tables had turned, and she was the one standing in the spotlight, alone and exposed. Unable to handle the growing whispers, she finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. People turned to me, some murmuring words of support, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I accepted their sympathy with a calm detachment, knowing that I'd achieved exactly what I set out to do. Over the following weeks, Rebecca's reputation continued to crumble. The friends she'd clung to, the social circles she'd once dominated, all of them slowly but surely began to distance themselves from her. She tried everything, apologies, tearful phone calls, even blaming me for ruining her life. But the evidence I'd shared, the undeniable truth of what she'd done, left her with no ground to stand on. Her final act of desperation came when she tried to get a mutual friend to plead her case to me. "Nick," she'd written in a letter that was delivered to my door, "I know I've made mistakes, but I don't deserve to be ostracized like this. We shared so many years together. Can't you at least give me a chance to make it right?" But I knew better than to fall for her act. Every word was carefully crafted to paint herself as the victim, a last-ditch effort to pull at my heartstrings. But the anger I'd felt that night had transformed into something colder, more resolved. She could beg, she could plead, she could cry her crocodile tears, but there was no saving her from the consequences of her choices. I tossed the letter into the trash, barely even reading it, and blocked her number on every device I owned. She was cut off completely and utterly isolated, and that was exactly where I intended to leave her. The last I heard from Kathy, Rebecca had moved out of town, fleeing from the ruined life she'd left behind. She'd lost her job, her friends, her social standing. Everything she'd valued, every illusion she'd clung to was gone. And the best part? She'd done it all to herself. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, the constant feeling of walking on eggshells around her. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and in the process, I'd given her exactly what she deserved. As I walked away from that chapter of my life, I didn't feel regret or remorse, only satisfaction. After Rebecca left town, I felt an eerie calm settle over my life. For years, I'd been trapped in the web of her deceit, in a marriage built on the illusions she'd carefully spun. The clarity I now felt was something I hadn't experienced in a long time, perhaps ever. I had my dignity back, my peace, and more importantly, I'd learned a lesson that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The fallout of her actions continued to ripple through our former social circles even after she was gone. The whispers about what happened to Rebecca became a permanent fixture in conversations that she was no longer there to defend. People would sometimes ask me, looking for confirmation or hoping for details, but I'd learned to keep my silence. I let the truth speak for itself, knowing that her reputation would continue to haunt her wherever she went. She could run, but her past would always catch up with her. In the weeks following her departure, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this point. I'd been raised to believe in loyalty, in the strength of commitment, in the idea that relationships required sacrifice. But I'd learned the hard way that loyalty isn't blind. Sacrifice means nothing when it's one-sided, and true love isn't built on empty promises and manipulation. One evening, as I sat alone on my back porch, I looked up at the stars and felt an unexpected wave of peace. It was the first time in years that I could simply sit in the quiet, knowing that I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop, that I wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's lies. I thought back to that night at the wedding, the way I'd felt as I watched her laugh and dance with other men, ignoring me as if I were invisible. That night, I'd been filled with anger and humiliation, a burning need for justice. But now, in the stillness of my new life, I felt only gratitude for having finally escaped her toxic hold. I'd built a life without her, piece by piece, and for the first time, I was proud of it. Friends I hadn't seen in years began reaching out, people who had distanced themselves during the worst years of my marriage, when Rebecca's manipulation had driven everyone else away. They welcomed me back with open arms, and I realized that while I'd lost years to her lies, I still had a future ahead of me that was mine to create. Then one day, months after I'd last seen or heard from her, I received a letter. My first instinct was to ignore it, to toss it in the trash like every other message she'd sent after I'd cut her off. But something compelled me to open it. Maybe it was the finality of it, the need to confront every last piece of our broken past before I could move forward fully. The letter was written in her usual elegant handwriting, but the words were unlike anything she'd ever said to me before. It was a long, rambling apology, filled with regret and admissions of things she'd never confessed while we were together. She recounted the night at the wedding, claiming she had been caught up in old feelings, and that her reckless actions had been fueled by insecurity and confusion. She apologized for the years of manipulation, the lies, the games. She admitted that she had pushed me away intentionally, hoping I would fight harder to pull her back, believing that I was weak enough to be controlled. But the most shocking part of the letter was when she wrote about her family. She confessed that they had always viewed me as a temporary fixture, someone she could use to create the appearance of a stable life without ever intending to commit fully. Her family's disdain had given her permission, in a way, to act as she pleased, knowing they would always take her side. She apologized for not valuing what I'd given her, for treating me as a placeholder in her life instead of the partner I'd tried so hard to be. At the end of the letter, she wrote that she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her, that she had been broken in ways she hadn't understood until she'd finally lost me. She expressed a hope that someday we could meet again, even just for a coffee, to talk about the good times and see how far we'd come. I finished the letter, sat in silence for a long moment, and then carefully folded it up. I didn't feel anger anymore. Her words meant nothing to me. They felt hollow, empty apologies from a woman who had spent her life running from her mistakes. I could sense that she had finally realized the emptiness of her actions, the loneliness that would follow her long after I was gone. But forgiveness? I didn't need to forgive her. I didn't need her closure, her apologies, or her explanations. The life I was building had no room for her regrets. I'd let go of the hurt, the betrayal, the anger. I'd reclaim my life from the ashes of our marriage, and I didn't need her to understand that. I placed the letter back in its envelope and set it aside, feeling lighter than I had in years. Rebecca had lost her power over me, and there was nothing left for her to take. Her letter was the last tether to a past that no longer defined me, and for the first time, I felt truly free. The next morning, I burned the letter in my fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the last remnants of her words, turning them to ash. It was a symbolic act, a final farewell to the pain and betrayal that had shaped so much of my life. I'd spent too long living in her shadow, and it was time to let the past fade, to look forward with hope rather than backward with regret. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild in earnest. I took up new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and spent time exploring the things I'd sacrificed during my marriage. I learned that life was bigger than one broken relationship, that true freedom lay in the ability to move forward without being haunted by the past. I'd thought revenge would bring me peace, that justice would heal the wounds Rebecca had inflicted. But in the end, it was letting go that truly set me free. The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars remained, a reminder of the lessons I'd learned. But those scars no longer defined me. They were simply a part of my story, a chapter I'd close for good. Rebecca's betrayal had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. I was stronger now, wiser, and perhaps a little less trusting. But I knew, without a doubt, that I would never let anyone control my life like that again. The love I'd sought so desperately was something I'd finally found within myself, a loyalty to my own happiness and well-being that no one could take away. Looking back, I realized that I'd been searching for validation in someone else's eyes, for a sense of worth that I believed only a relationship could bring. But the truth was that I'd found my worth in the ashes of our marriage, in the strength I'd discovered when I walked away. I was no longer the man who needed someone else to feel whole. I was complete, just as I was, free from the chains of my past. As I watched the last embers of Rebecca's letter die in the fireplace, I felt a quiet, profound sense of relief. The future stretched out before me, filled with possibility, free from the weight of her betrayal. I didn't know where I was going next, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was going forward alone, and that was enough. The lesson was clear. Some people come into our lives to show us who we don't want to be, to teach us the boundaries we'll never again allow anyone to cross. Rebecca had been that lesson for me, a painful, brutal lesson that had left scars, but also wisdom. And for that, in a way, I was grateful. As I left the past behind, I took one last look at the empty fireplace, knowing that the man I'd become was someone I could finally respect. Rebecca had lost her power, her place in my life, and all that remained was my own resolve. For the first time in years, I felt whole, and as I walked away from the embers, I knew that I'd found the peace I'd been searching for all along, within myself.